Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast with Ben Pakulski, one of the world's top professional bodybuilders, an expert on human performance and mindset mastery. Ben dives deep to deliver the strategies of the top experts to upgrade your body, mind, muscle, strength, performance, biochemistry, and how to become the upgraded modern man.
Welcome to the Muscle Expert Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Pakulski, and today we're going to interview one of my favorite humans on the planet, someone who's changed my life dramatically from a physical perspective. So throughout my bodybuilding career, I experienced a lot of hard training, and accordingly, I experienced some injuries. I experienced some inflammation. I experienced some things that I just couldn't feel, some muscles I couldn't contract. And sometimes I just started to believe that that was just me. I figured, I'm working hard. This is just part and parcel. This is part of the game. You can experience inflammation. You can experience soreness. You can experience injuries. And then pretty much by accident, in 2007, I discovered a gentleman by the name of Peter Chasson, rest in peace, who changed my life forever. He changed my mind. And he introduced me to a guy named Greg Roskopf, who is our guest today. And Greg is the creator and founder of Muscle Activation Techniques. I flew to Denver every single month on my own dime to have the amazing opportunity to work with Greg for 1 hour. And I saw such a tremendous change from this guy's thought process and modality. And it literally changed the way I look at exercise forever. It changed the way I think about exercise. It changed the way I think about the body. And Greg does such an incredible job in this conversation, telling you exactly how it started and exactly how it works and how you can use muscle activation to change your life right now, whether or not you have access to a practitioner or not. You're going to absolutely love the episode with Greg Roskopf. I'm extremely grateful for this man. And if you ever need your body fixed, if you're living in any type of pain, discomfort, inflammation, injury, or even as you'll hear Greg talk about some type of autoimmune disease or any inflammatory illness, you may want to consider muscle activation. And without further ado, here's Greg Roskopf and myself talking about the amazing entity that is Muscle Activation Techniques. Enjoy. So first of all, man, we'll just get rolling and get right into talking about how you discovered MAT. So I'm the one in my world telling people how great MAT is, how I believe MAT to be the best modality on the planet for improving function and muscle contractile ability. Tell our listeners about your history and how you really came to discover this modality you'd created.
Yeah, so actually, when I was young, when I was 19, I had a fractured vertebrae. And so I had a lot of residual problems. And literally as the years went on, I was still working out hard. I got a job. I was a strength and conditioning coach at Fresno State. So I was in that sports performance field. And, but after having that fractured vertebrae, I ended up having to sacrifice my last year eligibility in football and, went out, coached at Fresno State, and just had a lot of residual problems. Next thing I know, I'd have patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis, SI joint dysfunction, just one injury after another. And I was literally, as I was getting older, I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why do I keep breaking down? And I started looking at athletes in the same manner, and there were certain guys that would get bigger, faster, and stronger from their workouts, and that's what you'd expect at the collegiate level. And then there were those guys that just were always in the training room. They were always injured. And I'm sitting here like, that's me. I can relate to these guys. And the trainers and strength coaches, they're looking at these guys like, they're hypochondriacs. They're always injured, and they're blaming it on the athlete. And so I was in that situation where I could relate to them. And so I just started looking deeper into it. And being in the strength and conditioning world, I got my master's degree in exercise with an emphasis in exercise science, and so that was what I did on a day-to-day basis. I dealt with the muscle system and in the body and dealing with performance, and really didn't deal a lot with injuries. As strength coaches back then, if somebody was injured, they go to the training room. If they're healthy, they could start working out again, and there was not a lot of correlation. This is back in the 80s. There was not a lot of correlation between the training room and the strength coaches. I think that's grown a lot over the years, but it was like I was just dealing with it from a performance standpoint, but I was seeing these guys get injured, and in dealing with my own physical issues, I'm like, you know what, I need to understand more about this. And had a lot of opportunities over the years. I broke away from Fresno State, and I still worked as a consultant for them, but had worked in private practices and had the opportunity to work with some great physical therapists early on. I'd worked at this physical therapy group called Ferrante and Jackson Physical Therapy in Fresno. And this Richard Jackson taught courses all over the country on spinal mechanics and pelvic girdle and spinal mobilization techniques. And being a non-physical therapist, I had the opportunity to learn from somebody that really understood biomechanics and how the body functioned and came to it from a completely different perspective than I came to it. And I was actually hired by their company as an exercise physiologist to set up exercise programs. But I got thrown into the injury world because it was a physical therapy group. Everyone that was there was injured. And so I was setting up exercise programs for people with injuries. And with Richard Jackson, there was one time, I'd have these chronic issues, and one time my back was off and I wasn't feeling good. And he went through and he did an evaluation on me, and he said my big toe joint was locked up. And I have no idea why he's looking at my feet. And he mobilized my big toe, and my back pain was gone for the day. And I was like, how could my big toe have anything to do with my back pain? And like I said, he understood the biomechanics and the interrelationships of joints. And really, I started learning from him this whole integrated system, how the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, all the way to the occiput, everything's interrelated. And so I started really gaining a better understanding of the integrated system and the whole biomechanical aspect. And so from that point forward, I sought out other specialists in many fields, from physical therapy, chiropractic, podiatry, trainers, massage therapists. I sought out the specialists in every field. And the one thing I looked for when I was looking for instructors that were out there teaching their concepts was, do they understand biomechanics? Are they looking at it from a biomechanical approach? And so that got me started on my learning cycle. And
right.
For one standpoint, I always said I did it all for selfish reasons, because I was broken down. And I was literally, by this time, I'm 25 years old, saying, if I'm this bad at 25, what am I going to be like when I'm 50? And so I was frustrated. Again, I'm sitting here, what's wrong with me? And the interesting part was the common denominator with every practitioner that I sought out and every instructor that I sought out is they would do evaluations, and the common denominator in every field was you're tight. The reason that you're having these knee problems and back problems and SI joint dysfunction, all of these issues, plantar fasciitis, is because you're tight. So we need to stretch out all of these muscles. And so depending on the area of specialty, the podiatrist would put you in orthotics, the chiropractors would be teaching adjustment techniques, physical therapy was stretching, deep tissue work, mobilizations. The common factor with every field of specialty was we're going to teach you techniques of how to loosen up tissues and improve motion. And so I really felt like I had a great understanding of the interrelationships of joints, the biomechanics of the body, and I understood how increased stress, or if you have abnormal motion in one joint, it can put increased stress on other joints and tissues. And so I went down that road, and I was a performance enhancement coach. I was training athletes, and I became the guy in Fresno that was anyone that had injuries, they'd say, oh, if they were exercising, you need to see this guy. And the focus of everything I did, I had basically two focuses in this time. One was mobility. We need to make sure that you're mobile, but we also have to understand the interrelationships of joints. Where most people are focusing on the symptoms, we're going to look at the body as an integrated system and recognize that abnormal motion in, say, the foot or the lower body could put increased stress all the way up to the cervical spine. And so from a mobility or range of motion standpoint, that was my specialty. And then I had the opportunity to spend some time with Gary Gray, who, if anybody in the industry, he's the king of function. And there's a lot of people talking about functional movement. I mean, this was 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, he was the only one talking about function in the integrated system in functional training. And I had a unique opportunity at that point in time. He was only teaching his courses to physical therapists, but because of my background, I was one of the few people he kind of let in his classes that wasn't a physical therapist. So I felt like I had some very unique opportunities at a young age to work with some high-skilled practitioners. And so I worked in the function side. So my whole focus was, like I said, looking at the integrated system, dealing with functional training, and identifying where these imbalances and range of motion were, and had every technique out there that I learned to increase mobility, from stretching to deep tissue massage to mobilizations. I was taught of various techniques, and that was the primary focus. And the interesting thing about it all is, I was primarily working in the athletic field. And so working with athletes, you'll have success. With a lot of, I always say, you can do anything wrong with athletes and still have success with athletes, because the integrity of the neuromuscular system is so high that they're going to be able to adapt. That's how the body gets bigger, faster, and stronger. It's capable of adapting. And so with athletes, the accountability wasn't as high. Over the years, I started finding that when I got into the normal population, some of the techniques and principles that I was applying didn't work as effectively with the normal population as they did when I was working with high-level athletes. And that was part of the growth of the whole process. Now, the interesting part was I was one of those people. I was one of those people in the way that everything that I was learning, I was put in orthotics by some of the best people out there teaching how to prescribe orthotics. And I didn't have plantar fasciitis until after. I never had an inkling of plantar fasciitis until I was put in orthotics. And then, like I said, the patellofemoral syndromes, the SI joint dysfunction, or just having one injury after another, the things that I was doing and applying to my clients weren't working for me. And that was frustrating. It was like, I understand everything.
Talk about why that is. So we've gone through a lot of stuff that I'd love to dive into. So you talked about everyone addressing mobility. You talked about tightness, the idea of tightness. Why does an injury manifest as tightness? I'd love for you to talk about that, because I know that's leading down the path of kind of how you discovered MAT.
Yeah, and that's the perfect place that I'm at right now, is everything that I was doing and applying into my own principles, working with athletes I didn't work for me. And so I took a step back, and I'm like, well, why am I so tight? And so the question being so tight is like, simple terms is when you walk on ice. What's the first thing you do when you walk on ice? Is you tighten up as a protective mechanism. And so the natural neurological response is when the body senses instability, it tightens up as a protective mechanism. When you walk on ice, that instability is due to the external surface. But when you have muscle weaknesses, I didn't quite understand this at the time, but when you have instability or muscle weaknesses throughout the body, the neurological response is when the body senses these positions of instability, it tightens up as a protective mechanism. And so what I realized with all of these modalities that I was learning and all the techniques that I was learning to try and increase motion and improve mobility, I realized I was violating the protective mechanism. The protective mechanism was, I'm going to tighten up and protect you from getting into these positions of instability. And so tightness was a symptom, along with pain. Pain and tightness are symptoms. Your first sign of dysfunction, muscular dysfunction, is tightness. The second sign of muscular dysfunction is when you continue to put forces on the body, it finally shouts out in pain and says, stop doing this until you fix the problem. And so fortunately, as I'm evolving through all of this and frustrated, I was exposed to the final contact I had with people that were brought into my career for a positive reason was I got hired by the Utah Jazz, being this range of motion function specialist. And the chiropractor for the Utah Jazz did manual muscle testing. He was a specialty in clinical kinesiology, and he did manual muscle testing and literally correlated as he started showing me what he was doing. And I never found a place for manual muscle testing. I was exposed to it in my training and in the master's program. And but he went through and he showed me, he tested every muscle on my body. And I had about 80 muscles that were weak. And I was working out. I was strong. I was bench pressing close to 400 pounds, squatting 500 pounds. And nobody could have told me I was weak. And he's telling me I got, 40 to 50 muscles weak and 80 muscles weak. And I'm like, how can I have all these muscles weak? And so it started opening up my eyes that there's something wrong. There's positions of instability, and that maybe these positions of instability have something to do with this tightness. And obviously weak.
So talk about that a little bit, Greg. So how does somebody who can bench press 400 pounds and squat 500 pounds have 80 muscles that are weak? So because we have a lot of people that listen to this that are like, hey man, I'm strong. Like I squat well. I'm very, I can do this stuff. How does that happen? Or why is that happening? And how's that true?
Yeah. Weakness is a relative term when we're talking about it here for that exact reason. Like I said, I was squatting 500 pounds, bench pressing close to 400 pounds. I was strong, but the interesting part, and that's what I had to put together when I put this whole process, is I was strong, but I was unstable. And so that was, the confusing part is I had 80 weaknesses, but I could, relative to the normal population, I was strong. And so basically what happens whenever you have stress, trauma, or overuse, the resultant inflammation alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And so that the muscles can't contract efficiently. And when muscles can't contract efficiently, it's like having loose battery cables. The nervous system sends the information to the muscles, and it's just that electrical activity is just not getting there. And so that's kind of like there's a hesitation, and almost like somebody put a dimmer switch on your muscular system. And so the muscles can't, when you lose it, the muscles can't fire, and they can't fire on demand. And so it's a timing issue more than it is a strength issue. Because we recruit these smallest motor units, the slow twitch muscle fibers have the lowest threshold for activation. So when the nervous system sends input to the muscles, those slow twitch fibers are the ones that contract initially. Well, the slow twitch fibers, and they contract beyond their conscious control. And it's these slow twitch fibers that provide stability to joints and help us to maintain upright posture. So in reality, what I started recognizing, it wasn't about weakness, it was about timing. So we're not recruiting the slow twitch fibers. And the other part, when you have inflammation, slow twitch fibers, the metabolic characteristics of the slow twitch fibers begin to change. They become more fast twitch in nature. So they lose their oxidative capacity. The threshold to activation increases. So it requires more electrical impulse to create a contraction. And so that's where the timing gets off, is the end result of that inflammatory response is that it alters the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system so that the muscles just don't fire on demand. And like I said, so the first factor is the timing is off. And second factor is when muscles lose the ability to contract efficiently, they can't shorten effectively. And if they can't shorten effectively, then the opposite muscles won't lengthen effectively. So in reality, what happens, a muscle, I always say it's a fight for dominance. If I was going to flex my arm, my bicep muscles are shortening. And if my triceps are dominating for whatever reason, they're going to resist the pull of the biceps and not allow you to move your elbow into full elbow, your arm into full elbow flexion. And so in normal unconscious motion, as the biceps contract, there's a regulatory input to the antagonist muscle, the triceps, which says, I'm going to allow you to move through your full range of motion, but I'm always going to provide a sense of strength and stability. And
right. So talk about that. Talk about that specific thing quickly about how it correlates to hamstring tightness. So, everyone's on this listening to this podcast can relate to I have weak hamstring or I have tight hamstrings, right?
Yep.
Why is that?
And that was my first sign when I could barely, bend to touch my knees when my back, after my back pain. And so the fractured vertebrae was a result of a trauma. Stress, trauma, or overuse cause a result in inflammatory response. And so the muscles that actually weakened on me, where we had the loose battery cables, were my abdominals and hip flexors. And so when muscles can't contract efficiently, my abdominals and hip flexors could no longer contract efficiently. The opposite muscles are the lower back, the erector spinae, and the hamstrings. And so what happens was, because my abdominals, the muscle, I always think of when you can't move in a position, you have to think, what muscles move you there? Because if you can't move in the position, muscles move bones and muscles hold bones in proper alignment. If muscles can't contract efficiently, they can't do their job to move bones through the motion that the structure dictates. And then you also can't keep bones in proper position as like stabilized joints. You always want to have stability in joints, and you want stability through movement. And so you don't have that when you have muscle inefficiency or muscle weakness. And so the tight hamstrings are a result of the inability for the hip flexors and abdominals to contract. And when I first had some people that I had the opportunity to train in what I was doing, work on me directly, and I had them activate my abdominals and hip flexors, and for the first time in like 12 years, I reached down and touched my toes. And I had been stretching my hamstrings and my erector spinae, and the problem was every time I would stretch or get deep tissue massage, I'd wake up the next day with numbness and sciatica down into my big toe, and I couldn't get out of bed. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? Well, the problem was the tightness of the hamstrings was a symptom. The weakness was on the opposite side. So the problem was on the opposite side. I was violating a protective mechanism. The body was shouting out, quit doing this until you fix the problem. And that was the pain and sciatica that I was acquiring or waking up with the next day.
So all these people living with tight hip flexors and tight psoas muscle, that's an indication of weakness, probably from sitting too much, thereby their hamstrings aren't going to be able to fully lengthen. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and so the way that I think of it, we can generalize, but in a way of, when we're sitting, we're not using muscles, but in reality, every muscle in your body right now, while you're sitting talking to me, is contracting. They're contracting at a low level. Otherwise all your bones would fall into a pile. And so every muscle in the body is contracting. Well, those are the slow twitch muscle fibers that contract and contract beyond our conscious control. And so what happens when you start seeing deviations in posture, it's that certain muscles are not getting the proper input. And so dominant muscles start to take over. And sitting at a desk all day can create the muscle dominance and create these imbalances. But the idea of these imbalances aren't as much about strength as much as that whole idea, if we don't use it, we lose it. And if you're not using the muscles, then the muscles are going to, the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system is going to start to disintegrate. So that idea of movement is a good thing. Even low grade movement. You performed at the highest level, lifting, massive amounts of weights and performing, having maximum amounts of strength. But any time, and with the work that we worked at, any time that you had pain, there was associated weaknesses. And coinciding with that was associated tightness. And so tightness is the indicator something's wrong. And like I said, that's the first sign of dysfunction. And then pain, I always say pain's like your check engine light. Pain's saying, quit doing this until you fix the problem. It's telling you something's wrong, but it may be far away from where your pain is.
Hey, I interrupt the podcast to bring you a message about blueberries. You guys know my infatuation with blueberries is real. Why? massive brain benefits from the polyphenols, antioxidants, nitric oxide benefits, so many things about berries in general that I absolutely love, and I make them a consistent part of my day-to-day life. Here's the problem. Eating as many blueberries as you need to see a benefit is very, very expensive. Looking around $5 to $6 per serving when I buy them fresh, and even when I buy them frozen, it's still in the range of $4 to $5 for the size of serving that I'm after, which is somewhere in the range of 2 cups per serving, and I usually have that about twice a day. So what I've started doing, probably for the last 6 months, is after every workout, I'm consuming at least 2 servings of Organifi Red. So as you guys have heard, my friend Drew Canoli started this business, Organifi, and he's doing an incredible job sourcing really high-quality ingredients and putting them into convenient servings that allow you to easily access superfoods and amazing nutrients. So Drew has so graciously offered to give all of the Muscle Intelligence listeners or the Muscle Expert podcast listeners 20% off anything you get from Organifi. But you got to act now because that's not going to last forever. You can use the code Muscle Intelligence when you go to Organifi.com to get 20% off your entire order. And I think you're awesome, and Drew does too. So enjoy the rest of the show. So how does typical therapy modality fit into, what should actually be doing? Meaning most typical modalities, and I don't want to throw anybody to the bus, but you look at massage, you look at ART, you look at all these typical modalities are looking at simply going in and loosening up tight muscles. Does that have a place, or is that just a misguided thought process?
Well, there's definitely a place for it, and I look at MAT as being an adjunct to every field out there.
Yep.
In the way, if most, whether it's from a strength and conditioning standpoint, a flexibility standpoint, whatever that may be, you want to prepare the body to tolerate forces. And so if you think about loosening up tissues, like I said, with athletes, you can do anything wrong with athletes and still have success with athletes. So you may have a greater chance of having long-term changes in flexibility with athletes through various mobilization, stretching, and deep tissue work, because the tolerance level of those muscles are very high. But as people get more out of shape, they've been sitting at a desk all day and the muscles aren't contracting and they can't tolerate forces as efficiently, then we have to consider that. Every time we put a force on that body, we have to understand, or on particular tissues, is can those tissues tolerate this force? Because if they can't tolerate the forces you place on them, then it's going to have negative effects. And so it's not saying that stretching's bad or deep tissue massage is bad, because I was doing it. That was the focus of my treatment. And I got hired by the Utah Jazz and the Denver Broncos because of the specialty that I had that focused on range of motion. So I was having positive benefits with athletes because their tolerance levels were so high. But once tissues get stressed, that's when the tolerance levels decrease. The inflammation weakens tissues, muscles. It basically weakens muscles. You think about if you sprain an ankle. When you sprain an ankle, you limp. Why do you limp? You limp because it hurts. You put forces on the tissue. It's not as much the fact that the ligament is damaged. It's that all the supporting muscle structures that support that ankle can't tolerate the forces of ground reaction force, gravity, momentum, and body weight. And so every time you step on that ankle that's been stressed, it shouts out in pain saying, I can't tolerate these forces. So the goal with MAT is to say, let's go in and get all of those muscles activated, raise the tolerance level of those muscles, and all of a sudden it doesn't hurt as much. And so that idea is the focus of MAT is to improve the tolerance levels of the muscles so they can tolerate greater amounts of force. If the muscles can tolerate great amounts of force, go ahead and stretch them. Go ahead and deep tissue. Go ahead and put other physical stresses, but recognize that exercise is a stress. Stretching is a force being placed on tissue. Deep tissue massage is force being placed on tissue. And if you stress tissue that's already stressed, you may have negative effects. So this, I feel like, works as an adjunct to every one of the other modalities and saying, we're going to raise the tolerance level so you can tolerate all these other forces that people are putting on your body.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense, and it sounds absolutely clear what needs to happen and how it should be happening. Talk to me about how MAT actually does that. So we know that strengthening muscles move bones, strengthening muscles and making muscles work more effectively is the ideal ultimate result. But how exactly have you created a modality that does that and does it well?
So going back to my experience with the team chiropractor with the Utah Jazz, I was the range of motion guy, and I'm exposed to muscle testing. And many of the tests in clinical kinesiology test the muscles in mid-range position. I mean, if you're checking internal rotation, the piriformis would be tested in like 20 degrees of hip external rotation, but the person may have 45 degrees of external rotation. So what I was finding was that correlation between everything. As I started learning muscle testing and playing around with them, I started realizing that everyone that had a limitation in range of motion, there was correlating weaknesses that associated with that limitation in range of motion. So if I saw somebody that had 20 degrees of external rotation on the left side and 40 degrees on the right side, it's like, oh, they're tight. Well, my conventional thought process was I need to stretch the internal rotator. And then it was like, well, actually, there's correlating weaknesses here also. All the muscles that shorten into external rotation, from the piriformis to the obturator, gemellus, all these muscles that create external rotation or shorten into external rotation, I would test and they would be weak. And then I would get those muscles activated, and I'll talk about that in a second, and all of a sudden, not only were the muscles strong, but now all of a sudden that side could move to 45 degrees of external rotation also. And I'm like, man, I've been focusing on tightness my whole career, and now I'm finding that if I get muscles activated and I improve their ability to contract, they can shorten more effectively, and the opposite muscles will relax. So the whole... I had to go back and relearn my whole anatomy when I put this program together, because now I had to understand the function of every muscle, how it shortens, and how to test it from the shortened position. Because when you have inflammation, the muscles, there's a physiological reason behind it, but the weaknesses are going to show up in the shortened position. We're the strongest in neutral. That's why we revert to the neutral position when we walk on ice. We enclose ourselves toward our center of gravity, and the muscles are kind of encompassed around the neutral position in every joint. So, and you think about it, when somebody gets old and dysfunctional, their range of motion decreases throughout their body. Their gait patterns decrease, their stride length shortens, and so the same physiological changes that you see when somebody walks on ice, you start to see when somebody's neuromuscular system starts to decline, or the integrity of their neuromuscular system declines with age. And so tightness is a sign of weakness. And so that was the primary change. I had to make a paradigm shift in my whole thought process and recognize that every time that I see limitations in range of motion, it means that one or more of the muscles that cross that axis are potentially weak. So that example I used where the person had a limitation in external rotation on one side, one moved 45 degrees, the other only 20 degrees, that just showed me that the external rotators are weak. One or more of the external rotators on the limited side are weak. You get those muscles activated, all of a sudden, now there's greater range of motion. So the tightness is a result of weakness, and if you address the weakness, you will see greater ranges of motion, as long as there's not any structural changes that have occurred that are causing the limitation in range of motion. So as I started playing around with the testing, and I started correlating that if there was a limitation in range of motion, I needed to test these muscle tests in those extreme ranges of motion to identify the weaknesses. And so that completely changed. I've redefined many of the tests that came from clinical and applied kinesiology, whereas I would have to test them in their most approximated position because it correlated with the limitation in range of motion. Testing them in mid-range wasn't giving me proper information. I would actually get a strong test if I tested it in mid-range, but a weak test if I tested in the position of vulnerability. And so with that limitation, then it's like I started finding these weaknesses. I'm coming from a range of motion. I have no idea. I thought exercise is going to make these muscles strong. And so there was the next challenge is I I watched this chiropractor do applied kinesiology or clinical kinesiology, and he had this 20-minute technique that would get a muscle activated, but immediately, or in 20 minutes, this muscle would come back strong, and the force output would improve dramatically. And it was like, well, that took 20 minutes though. And so I was always trying to figure out, are there ways that you can actually activate muscles quicker without me not being a chiropractor or a medical practitioner, is there a way that I can do it without stepping out of the scope of what I do and what I'm licensed to do? And so the first thing that I recognized was, going back to Mel Siff's super training book, the isometric contractions could have a positive impact in strengthening muscles. And so I started playing around with isometrics, and I would do the isometric contractions in the shortened position of the muscle. So let's say that piriformis, where I said there was only 20 degrees of external rotation, I'd take them into that 20 degrees of external rotation, and then I would have them contract further into external rotation. Instead of like PNF stretching, where you would actually have them stretch the internal rotators and contract the internal rotators, a contract relax type stretch, I would do the opposite, and I would have them do low-grade isometric contractions in that shortened position. And then all of a sudden I realized, wow, these low-grade isometric contractions in the position of limitation bring stability to the muscles. I'd take a weak muscle and it would actually test strong after doing these isometrics. And so that was the first stage of figuring out, can we actually activate muscles on the spot? Because when I first started finding weakness, I was giving people exercises and they'd come back a week later and the muscles that I tested the week prior were still weak, which is interesting because it's a neurological aspect as opposed to a strength aspect. And so I was trying to tighten battery cables. So if you think of it, if you have a dead battery on your car, you can turn the key to the ignition all you want, but until you jump start the battery, you can't drive your car. Well, the muscle system's the same way.
Right.
If you have these muscle weaknesses, and muscle inhibition is what I call them, you have these positions of weaknesses, the body will have to compensate for those positions of weakness. So everything you do from an exercise standpoint will reinforce those imbalances, where the strong will get stronger and the weak stay weak, and you get stronger in your compensation pattern.
So speaking of that really quickly, that's what I experienced. And that's why I came out to see you every month, was no amount of isometric exercise or, what I would call perfect execution and then trying to activate a muscle was effective on fixing my imbalances. So, I had some injuries that were kind of old injuries that just live there. That all my lateral bending stuff, all my right shoulder stuff, no amount of exercise was able to fix that. I would come spend 1 hour with you. It was gone. It would last for often months. And I'm living that right now, which is why I'm talking about it, is because no amount of precise exercise activates a muscle the same way muscle activation does.
Right. Because you have to jumpstart the battery first. So the idea is you have to tighten the battery cables first, improve the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system so that the muscles can contract efficiently. Then your body will start using those muscles in its movement patterns. Otherwise, like I said, everything you do from a strengthening standpoint, if you think about it, if the timing is off, and the nervous system basically sends information to say, lift this weight, anything and everything that can contract at this moment in time will contract at this moment in time. The ones that have the loose battery cables, they end up jumping along for the ride. By the time they jump in, it's too late. So the idea is we want to give your body more to work with. And it's like having two men in the penalty box in a hockey game. Those three that are on the ice are working. They're overworking and they're sitting there saying, I need help. And then all of a sudden the two come out of the penalty box and it's like those three can start playing. They don't have to be as intense and can back off a little bit. Well, the muscular system's the same way. The body will get from point A to point B most efficiently with what it has to work with. And so, like I said, the nervous system just sends feedback and says, I need to lift this weight or I need to perform this function, and whatever can perform that function will perform that function. And I started to say earlier, compensation, that creates compensatory movement patterns, and compensation is a good thing until we fix the problem. Compensation is saying, with what I have the work to work with, this is the most effective way that I can get from point A to point B. With MAT, our goal is to give you more to work with. If we give you more to work with, then you're even going to be more efficient in your movement pattern. And
so before you talk about how to actually go ahead and how you discovered how to strengthen these things, what I'd like to talk about is, so when you talked about this internal external rotation deficit in the hip, you said that, well, if I find an external rotation deficit or an inability to get past 20 degrees of external rotation, I'm going to activate the muscles that externally rotate the hip. That makes sense. But how does one figure out that, I have this deficit, like you had a back pain and you fixed your feet and it made your back pain better? That's how I discovered you in MAT. I had massive knee pain. This is a story that I tell to everybody. I had massive knee pain in my left knee, and I went to see our friend Peter Chason, he started treating my feet. And I go, dude, I'd never met him before. I go, dude, the problem's not in my feet, it's in my knee. He goes, just let me do my thing. He fixes my feet. The pain, literally same pain, goes into my right knee, shifts sides. And I go, what the hell just happened? And then I come back the next week, he treats my feet again, pain's gone. I was like, how does someone treat my feet and my knee gets better? So can you talk to a little about like how, I mean, we understand that everything's integrated, but how do you start to identify and, how does that work? Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, the greatest tool we have, and I mean, it's such a complicated system because when I'm going through and I'm understanding the whole integrated system and the fact that the foot, the ankle, the knee, the hip, the trunk, everything up to the occiput is interrelated, and I'm working in professional sports and dealing with athletes, it really put a kind of a stress on me as I understand that, like, maybe their feet can cause back pain or their neck rotation can cause increased stress on the lower back or limitation in neck rotation. So how do I account for all this, especially when I only get about 10 to 15 minutes with each guy when I'm treating these athletes? Well, the greatest tool that we have, and I tell this to every person that ever learned the MAT practice, is the greatest tool that we have as MAT practitioners is the ability to assess range of motion. We're assessing range of motion for different reasons. But let's say somebody's coming in with low back pain, and I understand that it could be coming from the foot, it could be coming from the knees, it could be coming from the hip, it could be coming from the shoulder, it could be coming from the occiput, it could be coming from anywhere. I can go from a general range of motion screen, and I can check foot mobility, I can check hip mobility, and my first thing is going back to what you said about the feet, is we need to recognize the foot is the first thing that hits the ground, and the rest of the body has to respond to what the foot does. And most people are dysfunctional in foot mechanics with shoe wear and wall-to-wall carpeting, orthotics, and cushiony shoes. We're always trying to provide a false sense of stability to the feet. And when you provide artificial support to the feet, then the muscles of the feet are required to do less and less, and they become that whole idea. If you don't use it, you lose it. So that idea of the feet impacting everything up the chain is one key. But what's going to tell me if there's a foot problem versus maybe the problem's in the hips, or maybe it's coming from spinal motion, is I can go through a range of motion exam. And if I go through a general range of motion screen, I can look at some main motions in the foot from plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, pronation, supination, and say, they're moving pretty well. They're symmetrical. So I can move up, check the hip, and it's like, they're limited in hip internal rotation on the left side. And it's here's a problem. And so whatever jumps out from a limitation in range of motion, that's the body saying, here's a problem. I mean, the muscles that move you into this position can't contract efficiently. So a range of motion exam, we look at range of motion for the opposite reason, that paradigm shift in thought process. Wherever I see a limitation in range of motion, it's saying that one or more of the muscles that shorten or cross this axis are potentially weak. Now let's test and treat the muscles that show up weak. And so I can scan, literally when I've been with the Broncos, this is my 22nd year, and I can go through and scan, range of motion and know where I'm starting within a minute. And so now 14 out of those 15 minutes are going to be productive, as opposed to prior to this, when I was a range of motion guy, functional guy, I would have people come in for hour to hour and a half evaluations and then tell them, come back next week and we'll start your program. Well, an athlete doesn't have time to come back next week. They have to play on Sunday. And so they want you, if you don't make an immediate impact right away, they're not coming back. And so the range of motion screen is the most important tool that we have as MAT practitioners, because it's telling you where dysfunction is.
So one thing you brought up that's extremely important and relevant, I think, is this disparity between average people and athletes and their nervous system's ability to tolerate forces and adapt. Can you give us some insights into what that means and how we can influence it? Obviously, I know what that means, but why does an athlete have such an adaptable nervous system, and how can someone sitting at home get a more healthy nervous system? What are some of the influences that would impact that?
So probably one of the keys, the exercise world promotes health. And we know that if we exercise, there's enough research out there and studies that show that exercise enhances health. It's a cure-all for every disease out there. But then we brought up another factor, that inflammation is what causes muscles to go weak. And so if you sprain an ankle, the example I used earlier, the resultant inflammation is what weakens the supporting muscle tissue. Well, the end result of an inflammatory response is growth and repair of tissue. So we understand that from working out. If you get sore, you've created micro tears in the muscle tissue, which in turn create a low-grade inflammatory response, and sometimes it can be very painful. But the whole key is that inflammatory response has to resolve. And if that inflammatory response resolves, then you have growth and repair of tissue. If you don't get resolution of the inflammatory response and get into the growth and repair phase of inflammation, then you have chronic inflammation. That's a whole nother factor. And that's a negative factor. Inflammation is the common denominator behind almost every disease out there, from fibromyalgia to chronic fatigue to coronary heart disease to diabetes to, obviously insulin resistance with that, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's. Inflammation is a common factor behind every one of these diseases. And so inflammation in its resolve state is a good thing because you do get bigger, faster, stronger. Inflammation that doesn't resolve becomes systemic, and then it becomes part of the stress response that your body's going through. And then the key is, if you stress a system that's stressed, you're compounding inflammation. So, and I'll just throw it out there in perspective, is if I continue to stress a system that's stressed, if somebody has low-grade systemic inflammation and I'm making them sore, if I'm a trainer and I'm working them out hard and I'm making them sore, I'm basically stressing a system that's stressed, and I may increase their symptoms of diabetes. I may increase their symptoms with cholesterol and blood pressure. Right. And I may be compounding the problems. And then all of a sudden, exercise may not be what we classify it as, with the quality of creating the quality of health. And so that's the important part. So like you said, with athletes, they're going to have a low-grade injury. They pull a hamstring or they go out and overdo it. I'm working in training camp right now, and I see these guys come in. They're beat up. And one of the athletes actually said to me the other day, his hip flexors were weak. And so he's like, well, why are these so weak? And he was having some low back pain. And he goes, well, why are these so weak? And I was like, because you overdid it. Your body has a tolerance level, and you exceeded that tolerance level. So relatively, you're overtraining. And during training camp, you're overtraining. And the idea is, but you got to go back and do it tomorrow. The nice thing about MAT, or the nice thing about general exercise, if you overdo it or you overtrain, you can rest. You don't have to go back the next day. You're not required to do it. Athletes are required to do it. And that's what I told them. The nice thing about it is, what I'm doing is I'm kicking you out of the acute inflammatory stage into the growth and repair stage so you can recover. Basically, what MAT is, provides that environment so muscles can recover and repair themselves. It's a quicker process. If we do it on our own, we need time. We need time, we need rest, we need recovery. And so
talk about that a little bit. How does that happen? So how is MAT able to kick this body back into the natural recovery process? Just by reactivating the muscle's ability to contract?
Yep, by improving the communication between the nervous system and the muscle system, it starts to resolve that inflammatory response. I talked about isometrics as a form of activation. Yep. The other form of activation is a hands-on stimulation, where we actually stimulate the sensory receptors at the origin and insertion of the muscles. And what I find is when muscles are weak like this, they're inflamed. Inflammation causes a weakness, and it can be very tender. And as I work with people, the more I work with them, they're like, are you pushing as hard as you were the other day? Or I mean, that's not as painful as it was, because it's actually resolving and it's kicking them into the growth and repair state. Because as soon as the muscles can, the whole idea is if we're improving the ability for the muscles to contract, we're raising their force tolerance level. And if you raise their force tolerance level, now they can go back out and put forces on the body that don't compound the inflammatory response. And so it actually, that is what enhances, that's what allows, or is why MAT can actually be a part of the recovery process, is because now it's allowing you to tolerate greater amounts of force, so you're not compounding, so you're not continuing to stress a system that's already stressed. So now the inflammatory response can resolve, and then you have the positive effects of inflammation rather than the negative.
One of the stories I tell about one of the first times I ever worked with our great friend Eric Seifert, an MAT practitioner, was I went in the day after a very intense leg workout with probably like an 8 out of 10 perceived, tissue pain tolerance, like soreness, typical muscle soreness. Got an MAT session, and the muscle pain from the workout was completely gone. And I was like, what the hell just happened? And that, for the first time, changed my paradigm around what exercise actually is. Like, what's actually happening if this one modality can actually make me recover faster, or perceived recovery be faster? Muscle pain was gone. Can you talk about that? Is that just what's happening? We're reigniting this nervous system's ability to communicate. And if so, then what is muscle soreness? Is it just an inflammatory response that we're perceiving as this soreness?
Yes, soreness is I mean, one of the signs of an inflammatory response is pain.
Yep.
And so muscle soreness, and basically, I have my own philosophies on all of this. And I mean, the whole idea of exercise is you create this low-grade inflammatory response, and then you get the growth and repair of tissue. Especially since I work with, a lot of autonomic disorders and autoimmune disorders, systemic inflammatory-based disorders, every disease state that I've talked about. And I've been able to show that improving the integrity and the tolerance level of the muscles take away the symptom and improve symptoms related to, any one of those diseases I had talked about, from diabetes, coronary heart disease, everything. And so the idea is that if you have unresolved inflammation, it's a stress. It's part of a stress response. And so the question is if the muscles have certain tolerance level. Every muscle in your body has a certain tolerance level based on its history. So if you've repeatedly sprained your ankles playing football, and that was your weak link, your tolerance levels for those muscles that support the ankle are going to be very low. And so recognizing overuse, misuse, and disuse are what cause altered communication between the nervous system and the muscle system. And over time, these factors start to compound themselves. And so when you have a low threshold, a low tolerance level in the muscles, and you exceed that tolerance level, it results in an inflammatory response, which in turn causes inhibition of the muscle, this altered communication we're talking about. That means there's going to be pain. Muscle soreness, there's 100% correlation between muscle soreness and weakness. And so the tolerance level of the muscles are actually now even in a further weakened state because of the inflammatory response. And now those tissues have to heal. If we don't allow them to heal, and we continue to put stresses on them, then we never get into that growth and repair recovery state of inflammation. And so the whole goal of MAT is to get those muscles reactivated, raise the tolerance level so they can heal. With exercise, many people that work out are relatively overtrained. And so most people are overtraining. They're not allowing, recovery is the most important factor related to exercise. And if you're not allowing your tissues to heal, then you don't get the growth and repair of that tissue. And if you think of Olympic lifters or power lifters, if they do a heavy workout, let's say with deadlifts and squats, they have to wait 7 to 10 days to fully recover before they can go heavy again. Correct me if I'm wrong there. Yeah, and why do they have to wait 7 to 10 days? Because they have to let the inflammatory response resolve and allow their muscles to recover. There's people in the gym working out day after day after day and never allowing their tissues to recover.
And wondering why they don't get progress.
They don't get any results because they're actually in a catabolic state rather than an anabolic state. And the catabolic state, it's a stress. So you're continually stressing a system that's stressed. And so your soreness when you were working out was a result of you overdid it. You exceeded tolerance levels in all of those muscles. And now you have a couple choices. I got to back off and allow these muscles to recover before I can train again. And like we just talked with powerlifters, that may be 7 to 10 days. As a bodybuilder, you're not going to back off for 7 to 10 days.
Right.
What MAT does with you, and like the Denver Bronco guy I was talking about the other day, is it speeds up that recovery process. It sets up that next stage of inflammation, which says now we can heal. And the first part of that is raising the tolerance level of the muscle so you're not continually breaking it down.
Right. Another great example of that is that time I flew out to you. I was 5 weeks out from Olympia, and I was training in Gold's Venice, and threw my back out, whatever that means. I something in my back was ridiculously tight, like to the point that I couldn't stand up. I flew to Denver, did 1 hour of treatment with you, and you're like, I literally couldn't stand up. I was hunched over in pain. And you're like, hey, man, I could move. I had still a little bit of not soreness, but tenderness there from, having been in pain for 3 days. And you're like, hey, man, go train it. And I haven't even stood up straight in 3 days. And you're like, go train it. Go try to break it. And I was like, what do you mean? And it worked. I went and did 4-plate bent rows after not being able to stand up. But when I started contracting it, like the difference was massive. And that's just you. Like I thought I was in pain. I thought it was going to take, days or weeks to recover. I thought I might not be able to do the Olympia, 1 hour with you, and all of a sudden, bang, it may have been 90 minutes, but 1 hour with you. And, all of a sudden, gosh, now not only can I extend my spine, but I can actually contract all the muscles around there, which at that point, I don't think I could have. So just speaking to this immediate response that you're going to get from activating those muscles to be able to do what they're actually capable of doing. So one thing I want you to talk about, you're a very modest guy, but I want you to talk about, I've seen you do some pretty incredible things with people who have lacked muscular innervation. Period. I don't want to throw stories out there, but you can choose to do it as you wish. People who have had, the inability to walk or the inability to stand properly, the inability to walk properly, lack of neck and tricep function, speaking to one specific person, letting you go down whatever path you want to go. Talk about what, type of results you've seen and, some of the extreme cases of, changing people's lives ultimately that you've experienced.
Yeah, I've had a great experience. The job that I do is so rewarding on a day-to-day basis. I've worked in professional sports for 30 years, and it's rewarding working with athletes and being able to help them perform. But it's nothing compared to working with someone whose life has been taken away from them due to some form of injury or disease, and knowing that you can actually have a positive impact on somebody's quality of life, that's probably the most rewarding. If somebody goes and makes another $10 million a year playing a sport, that's great and that's fun. But the quality of life part has been probably the part I've enjoyed this the most. And I've dealt with multiple. Every form of autoimmune disorder, digestive issues. A young 8-year-old kid with Asperger's, Hypotonia, with a form of autism, and been able. I'll use him as a perfect example.
That's a great example.
8 years old, and he's got this Asperger's, Hypotonia, and his body was just dysfunctional. And his parents were personal friends of mine, and they said, do you think there's anything to do that you can do with this? And I go, and I just need to look at the body and see, how he functions and see if there's any muscle issues there. And now Asperger's Hypotonia is basically saying you're hypermobile. And the muscles cannot contract efficiently to provide stability at joints, so they would actually dislocate joints. Well, this kid comes in, and I'm expecting someone hypermobile dislocating, and he was tighter than I ever been in my life. Like he couldn't even bend to touch his knees. And I said to the mom, "You sure it's hypotonia and not hypertonia?" And she said, "Well, he used to be very hypermobile, and he used to always get injured, and now his body's restricted." And she's telling his history. Well, the kid at 8 years old, he's got lactose intolerant, gluten intolerant. He's coordination's off, his mental focus. They were homeschooling him, and he couldn't. He was very, bad in his learning, and so just a lot of issues that you would expect. And so when I first assess his motion, he's just tight everywhere. And so I always work with a process that's more advanced in the MAT technique. It's called RX, which I say MAT prescriptive rules, which basically creates a whole neuromuscular overhaul. It starts from square one and says, we're going to do an overhaul on your whole neuromuscular system. And he was the perfect example of someone who needed an overhaul. Every single muscle in his body, the tolerance level was very low in every muscle in his body. And that was represented by the fact that he was chronically tight everywhere. And so as I worked with him, we started improving his muscle function, and literally as we improved his muscle function through his core, he went from barely being able to get to his knees when he stood and did a reach toward his toes, and by the end of that day, he was, literally like an inch away from touching his toes, and just much more relaxed. Well, in the process of all of this, through treating the muscular system, keeping the story short here, through treating the muscle system repetitively over a 6-month period, he gained flexibility throughout his body. He was no longer lactose intolerant, no longer gluten intolerant. His focus and cognitive awareness all dramatically improved. His learning ability improved. The kid is now, I think, about 13 or 14 years old. He's golfing, he skis, he's living a normal life. And his mom said, it was just sad at the beginning. He couldn't even function. He couldn't even play on the playground with kids his age. And now he's living a normal life. And so those type of issues there's when the body's stressed and inflamed or there is some disease state, you think of all the side effects to every medication that people take. That puts stress on the system, on the body as a whole. And so the other part is this kid is off of all of his medications also. And so it just reestablished his whole total body function. And I see that with autoimmune disorders. And I talk about that with lactose and gluten intolerance and the digestive orders. Like, how can treating muscles actually affect digestion? And I'm finding more and more out the deeper I go into this. But I've had people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis that by improving muscle function, it's actually minimized their symptoms of the disease. And because those diseases are all inflammatory based. And so if you think of the surface area that the muscle system covers, the mass of the mother, look at your body when you're over 300 pounds bodybuilding, the mass that covers, it literally, when you have total body or systemic inflammation, you only have so many immune cells and only so much artillery to go start. The whole reason we have an inflammatory response is to repair damaged tissue. So you have all of this damaged tissue with low tolerance levels that you keep putting, day-to-day activity like this kid was too stressful for what his body could tolerate. And so it compounded the inflammation. Well, as we began movement by movement, muscle by muscle, to raise the tolerance level of the muscles, now all of a sudden you need less artillery. And now all of a sudden, a flu bug comes in, or there's some bacteria. Now the immune system says, I can fight this off now because I was over here. I was too busy trying to repair this damaged tissue that I couldn't do the job that the immune system normally is supposed to do. And people say you have a weakened immune system. They don't have a weakened immune system. They have an overactive immune system that they can't fight off disease or bacteria because they're too busy trying to heal damaged tissue. And there's where I go back to that. A young kid like this at 8 years old, he was overtrained. Everyday life was too much stress, too much physical stress for what his body could tolerate, from what his muscle system could tolerate. So he was relatively in an overtrained state, but he wasn't even exercising. And so when you see people with fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue, those are muscle-based, diseases. There are muscle weakness-based diseases, and the same idea is they're in such a physically stressed state that everyday activity is too stressful for them. And then they try and exercise, or they go to therapy and they give them stretches or exercises. Well, that's, I always say you might as well take a baseball bat and beat them with it, because you're actually, again, you're stressing a system that's stressed. And what you have to do is take them backwards before you can go forward. You actually have to quit doing exercise, back off all of the physical things you're doing so that we can raise your tolerance level and on a step-by-step, movement-by-movement basis. And then we can gradually start to implement exercises and movements that your body can tolerate. And then all of a sudden, now exercise has the positive impact it's supposed to have rather than the negative impact that is actually compounding your disease or your symptoms.
Is there something that people listening at home can do right now to start implementing, the most base level of this muscle activation? Obviously, the best step is to come see you or one of your MIT practitioners all around the world. But is there something they can start doing right now to start seeing improved range of motion benefits, improved muscle activation benefits, so they can get a feel for what this is supposed to be like?
Yeah, from the most general standpoint, having a skilled practitioner work on you is probably, the ideal, as you know, the ideal situation. But from the most general standpoint, it's looking at their own ranges of motion in a way of saying, I always say, I don't care what you can do, I know what you can't do, because what you can't do is breaking you down. And so the movements the positions that you can't move into are an indicator that something's wrong. So if you just went through a general range of motion scan, just if somebody just understands, like think about what movements you would stretch in. Like you would stretch your hamstrings by going into hip flexion. You stretch your quads by going into hip extension and knee flexion. And think about what positions am I typically trying to stretch? Or what movements am I typically trying to stretch? Because those are telling me where the problems are. And I would say if there's significant problems, and if you've stretched day after day after day, week after week, month after month, and you're still as tight as you've ever been, then you have to finally, say, you know what, maybe this isn't working for me. And you got to go to an alternative route. And the alternative route is to say, well, based on these principles that we've talked about today, I want to do the opposite. I'm actually trying to stretch the tissue that might be part of the protective mechanism. And if I violate the protective mechanism, it's going to tighten up even more. So let me think the opposite and say, if I'm trying to stretch my quad, the muscle that actually is shortening when I'm stretching the quad, just think about on the opposite side of the axis, is the hamstrings. And so what I want to do is actually perform a really light intensity isometric, where you would contract your hamstrings, which in turn would stretch the quad. But instead of pulling it in the further stretch on the quad, just push into your hand and curl your hamstring. Or curl your leg into your hand to activate the hamstring. And then what you'll actually find at very low intensity, if you did 6-second holds at low intensity, you'll actually find that all of a sudden the quads will relax. And it's not traumatic. It's not stressing tissue that's already stressed. It's actually a form of activation. It's a very general way of doing it. But if you went through any motion, if you can't turn your head to the left, then just put your fingers against your head and rotate your hand your head to the left into your fingers and just hold that position for 6 to 8 seconds. And then the positions you can't move into are the positions that you want to perform some form of activation. The isometrics in that end range position provide a sense of activation to the muscles.
Amazing. And I do that all the time. And that there's a huge correlation, like you say, with the health of the internal organism. Like if someone's very inflamed, I don't see a quick response with that. But for someone who's actually got a really healthy internal ecosystem, the response is literally immediate, right? If someone's lacking hip flexion, can't get to a bottom of a squat, or if they want to get better range of motion at their shoulder, it's literally instant if they're doing it correctly. And I think one of the biggest errors we should point out is trying to use too much force. It's more of a specific contraction than it is a forceful contraction. Yeah. Greg, man, I don't want to take any more of your time, but this is the most incredible, informative, enlightening conversation that every one of these listeners is going to absolutely love. Where can they find more from you, and how do they get in touch with you and one of your practitioners? Yeah,
so all of our information, if you go to our website, is muscleactivation.com. If you're interested in learning more about the education, there's a path to go through and learn about our education program. If you're somebody that's dealing with some health issues, you can go to Finding a Practitioner, and we have a list of all of our practitioners nationwide, even internationally, that have come through and have maintained their certification through this program. It's, like I said, a powerful tool. If you have the access to see a specialist in your area, I think it will change the way you look at the body.
Absolutely, Greg. Thank you so much for your time. You're truly a gift to this world, and I'm so grateful for you and continuing to help me through my life and all of these athletes and just average people live their greatest life. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with you over the years and continuing.
Yeah, man. Hopefully forever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Keep me going. And that's a wrap, ladies and gentlemen. What did you think about the amazing Greg Roskopf? So as I told you, this guy does not disappoint, right? He's absolutely brilliant and such a coherent conversation about filling in all those gaps. And if you're skeptical about any of this stuff, I see it. I've seen it myself. I've experienced it myself, and I see it every time I go into his office. There's somebody in there who has literally had their life changed, who has literally experienced incredible results. And there's documented cases of high-level professional athletes who have had massive injuries. And like I said, I'm not going to be the guy to throw out names, but if you guys research Greg and go on his website, you'll see there's people who he's literally changed their life. And from the one simple example he gave on the show compared to the hundreds and hundreds that I've seen firsthand. So if you're someone who's living a life with an injury or pain, I highly suggest you check out MBT. I highly suggest you actually travel to Denver and work with one of Greg's people in person if it's possible for you. Obviously Greg's got people all around the country. I had the amazing opportunity to work with the creator, and I don't take that for granted for 1 second. Greg's an extremely busy guy, and getting in his schedule is usually booked out 6 to 8 months in advance. But he's also got people who are working there in his office with him that are equally as effective and life-changing as well. I hope you guys enjoy the show. If you did, send this to someone who has an injury. Send this to someone who's maybe has an inflammatory disease, an inflammatory illness that perhaps could be influenced by muscle activation techniques. Now, I'm not saying this is going to fix it. I'm not saying this is the cure for everything. But if you're someone who's looking for a healthy solution to fixing your body and living your greatest life, this is an awesome, awesome opportunity. Have a great day. Share the episode with one person. And if you enjoyed it, leave us a review. I'd appreciate to hear from you. Have an awesome day, guys. Live your greatest life in your greatest body.
Join us on benpokulski.com to learn the cutting-edge techniques to take control of your body, your brain, and create your greatest life.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.